On a quiet September afternoon in the Scottish Highlands, the world paused. Inside a stone castle surrounded by purple heather and ancient hills, a 96-year-old woman lay in silence. Outside, the River Dee moved gently through the valley, unchanged by decades of war, politics, scandal, and progress. Inside, history was drawing to a close. She had ruled for 70 years. She had met presidents, popes, revolutionaries, and dictators. She had witnessed the fall of empires and the rise of the digital age. And yet, she was never meant to be queen. Welcome to the channel. Tonight, we begin a deeply detailed, dramatic, and emotional journey through the real life of Queen Elizabeth II, not as a symbol, but as a human being shaped by duty, sacrifice, love, and history itself. If you appreciate long-form historical storytelling, take a moment to subscribe. These stories take time, research, and dedication. And your support helps continue them. Now, let us go back. Not to the crown. Not to the throne. But to a small London townhouse in 1926, where no one imagined history was being rewritten. London between wars, 1926. The Britain of 1926 was powerful, but uneasy. The First World War had ended only 8 years earlier. Nearly 1 million British lives had been lost. The empire stretched across continents, yet cracks were forming. Ireland had broken away. Workers were restless. Economic depression loomed. King George V sat on the throne, disciplined, firm, traditional. He had steered Britain through war. Stability mattered above all. On April 21, 1926, at 2:40 in the morning, a baby girl was born at 17 Bruton Street in Mayfair. Not in a palace. Not beneath royal banners. But in the London home of her maternal grandparents. She was delivered safely. Healthy. Strong. She was named Elizabeth Alexandra Mary. At birth, she was third in line to the throne. Her grandfather was king. Her uncle, the Prince of Wales, stood ahead of her. Her father was the spare. There was no expectation, none, that this child would rule. She would live comfortably. She would attend ceremonies. She would smile and wave. But she would not carry the crown. History was quiet that morning. It gave no warning. Her father, Prince Albert, known privately as Bertie, was not charismatic like his older brother. He struggled with a severe stammer. Public speaking caused visible anxiety. He had never desired power. Her mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, was warm and socially gifted. She believed in affection over intimidation. She believed her children should laugh. Their home at 145 Piccadilly was comfortable, not extravagant by royal standards. It felt lived in. Personal. Young Elizabeth, called Lilibet by family, grew up in an environment of routine and structure. She was observant. Orderly. Serious beyond her years. Relatives noticed something unusual: she rarely threw tantrums. She followed instructions carefully. She preferred calm over chaos. In 1930, her younger sister Margaret was born. Margaret was lively, expressive, mischievous. Elizabeth was steady. The sisters loved each other deeply, but even then, there was contrast. Margaret shone. Elizabeth endured. No one yet understood how important that difference would become. The empire she was born into. When Elizabeth was a child, the British Empire covered nearly a quarter of the globe. Canada, Australia, India, parts of Africa, territories across the Caribbean and Asia, all connected under the crown. Maps and schoolrooms were colored pink. But beneath the surface, independence movements were growing. Colonies were questioning control. The modern world was shifting. Elizabeth grew up hearing about distant lands she had never seen. She was taught that monarchy meant service, not domination. Her education was private. She never attended public school. Tutors came to the palace. She studied British constitutional history, French language, literature, religion, the structure of parliament. Not as academic curiosity, but as preparation. At first, it was theoretical. That would change in 1936. 1936, the year everything broke. January 1936. King George V died. The Prince of Wales became King Edward VIII. He was popular, charming, modern. But Edward was in love with Wallis Simpson, an American woman who had been divorced. And soon to be divorced again. The Church of England opposed it. The government opposed it. The public was divided. The king was expected to choose the crown over romance. Edward chose love. In December 1936, he abdicated. It was unprecedented. For the first time in modern British history, a reigning monarch stepped down voluntarily. And in that moment, 10-year-old Elizabeth's life shifted permanently. Her father, Bertie, shy, reluctant, unprepared, became King George VI. Elizabeth became heir presumptive. No longer a spare princess. Now the future queen. She did not cry publicly. She did not protest. But childhood ended that winter. Learning to be queen. The move to Buckingham Palace was overwhelming. The ceilings were higher. The halls colder. The expectations heavier. Her father struggled with the role, especially public speeches. The pressure of kingship weighed on him visibly. Elizabeth watched. She learned not from books, but from observation. She saw how her father forced himself to speak despite fear. How he never complained about responsibility. How duty came before personal desire. Private tutors shifted focus. Constitutional law became central. She was taught the limits of royal power. That a monarch rules symbolically, not politically. She learned the delicate balance between government and crown. She understood something early. The monarchy survives by restraint. This lesson would define her entire reign. War returns, 1939. Elizabeth was 13 when Britain declared war on Nazi Germany. Air raid sirens echoed through London. Bombs fell. Buildings burned. There were discussions about sending the princesses to Canada for safety. Her mother refused. The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king. Instead, Elizabeth and Margaret were moved to Windsor Castle for protection. From there, Elizabeth experienced war not as a general, but as a young woman aware that her nation was under threat. In 1940, at age 14, she gave her first radio broadcast. Speaking to children who had been evacuated from cities, she offered reassurance. Her voice was steady, clear, measured, already trained in calm. Later, at 18, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service. She trained as a mechanic and driver. She changed tires, repaired engines, drove military trucks. For the first time, she wore uniform. For the first time, she earned something outside royal privilege. She was known as Second Subaltern Elizabeth Windsor. Not, Your Royal Highness. Not, Princess. Just Elizabeth. That mattered to her. Victory, and a secret night. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. London erupted in celebration. Crowds flooded the streets. That night, Elizabeth and Margaret slipped quietly into the city, joining the crowd anonymously. They laughed. They walked. They celebrated with strangers. For a few hours, Elizabeth was not heir to the throne. She was a 19-year-old young woman in a free country. She later described it as one of the most unforgettable nights of her life. Because it was freedom without expectation. But freedom would not last. The man who would stand beside her. Before the war, in 1939, she had met a naval cadet. Tall. Confident. Energetic. Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. They began writing letters during the war. What began as polite correspondence became something deeper. Philip was direct. Sometimes blunt. Unlike anyone in her sheltered world. By the end of the war, Elizabeth knew something clearly. She would marry him. But he was foreign. His family connections complicated. His background unstable. The establishment hesitated. Elizabeth did not. And as she approached her 21st birthday in 1947, she made a public vow that would echo for the rest of her life. I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service. She meant it. She always meant it. What she did not know was how soon that promise would be tested. In 1952, Elizabeth would leave Britain as a princess on a royal tour. She would land in Africa smiling, confident, young. And within hours, everything would change. She would return home not as a daughter, not as an heir, but as queen. At just 25 years old. In part 2, we will uncover the emotional strain of her marriage, the tension between love and monarchy, the shocking moment in Kenya when her father died, and how a young woman stepped into a crown she never truly expected to wear so soon. Because destiny does not knock politely. Sometimes it arrives while you are asleep. Before we continue, from which country are you watching this story? And what time is it right now where you are? Elizabeth was 25 years old when destiny caught up with her. She had married for love. She had become a mother. She believed she still had time. Time to grow. Time to prepare. Time to remain a daughter a little longer. But history rarely waits. In November 1947, Elizabeth married Philip Mountbatten at Westminster Abbey. Britain was still recovering from war. Food was rationed. Clothing coupons were required, even for a princess. Yet the wedding brought light into a nation still shadowed by bombed streets and broken homes. Elizabeth looked radiant, but behind the silk and pearls stood a young woman stepping into adulthood under immense scrutiny. Philip had given up everything to marry her. He renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles. He adopted a British surname. He converted religions. He left behind his naval independence. He became Duke of Edinburgh. But what he truly became, was husband to the future queen. At first, they lived quietly in Malta, where Philip was stationed with the Royal Navy. Those months were among the happiest of Elizabeth's life. She was not yet queen. She was simply a naval officer's wife. She drove herself. She shopped. She laughed freely. In 1948, their first child, Charles, was born. 2 years later, and followed. Elizabeth adored her children, but her responsibilities were already growing heavier. King George VI's health was failing. Years of stress, heavy smoking, and the burden of unexpected kingship had weakened him. He rarely complained. He continued his duties. But those closest to him could see the decline. Elizabeth began stepping in. She represented him at ceremonies. She delivered speeches on his behalf. She toured in his place. She was preparing, though no one said it openly. In January 1952, Elizabeth and Philip departed on a Commonwealth tour. The king was too ill to travel. The young princess would go in his stead. It was meant to be routine. Kenya first. then Australia and New Zealand. On February 5, they visited Treetops Lodge in Kenya, a unique structure built in a giant tree overlooking a watering hole. That evening, they watched elephants gather under moonlight. Elizabeth went to sleep a princess. During the night, in England, her father died peacefully in his sleep at Sandringham. A blood clot in his heart ended his life at 56. The message traveled slowly. Philip was told first. He walked toward Elizabeth. He had to find the words that would change her life forever. When he told her, she did not scream. She did not collapse. Witnesses later described her reaction as composed, almost immediate acceptance. There was grief. Deep grief. But above it, understanding. She was no longer Princess Elizabeth. She was Queen. She flew back to London in black clothing borrowed for the journey. When the plane landed, Prime Minister Winston Churchill waited on the runway. The young woman descending the steps was now sovereign of multiple nations. There had been no rehearsal for this exact moment. No gradual transition. One heartbeat, she was daughter. The next, she was monarch. The burden was absolute. She chose the name Elizabeth II. Some questioned it, especially in Scotland, where there had never been a previous Queen Elizabeth. But she stood firm. The continuity mattered. She was crowned not in that instant, but in duty. Her coronation would take place more than a year later, on June 2, 1953. The ceremony was ancient. Ritualistic. Sacred. Westminster Abbey filled with thousands of dignitaries. Millions watched on newly purchased television sets. For many households, it was their first experience of live broadcast. Elizabeth insisted cameras be allowed inside. Tradition resisted. She understood something crucial. The monarchy had to be seen to survive. The anointing, hidden beneath a canopy, marked the spiritual core of the ceremony. Holy oil touched her hands, chest, and head. The crown, heavy, jeweled, unforgiving, was placed upon her. She did not smile widely. She did not wave. She absorbed it. From that day forward, she belonged not to herself, but to history. After the ceremony, she returned to Buckingham Palace through rain and cheering crowds. She was 27. Her reign had begun. But being crowned is one thing. Remaining steady in a changing world, is another. The 1950s brought movement. 6-month tours across the Commonwealth. Endless handshakes. Speeches. State dinners. She learned pacing. She learned endurance. She learned how to speak without revealing too much. Every Tuesday evening, she met privately with the Prime Minister. No notes were taken. No transcripts kept. She listened. She asked questions. She never publicly interfered. Over decades, she would meet 15 prime ministers. Governments would fall. Policies would change. Crises would erupt. But she remained. Consistency became her power. At home, Philip adjusted to life behind the throne. It was not easy. He had once commanded ships. Now he walked 3 steps behind his wife. Tension existed. It had to. But partnership endured. They were different in temperament. He direct. She restrained. He impatient. She deliberate. Yet the foundation held. In 1960, Andrew was born. In 1964, Edward followed. Elizabeth balanced motherhood with monarchy as best she could. Some believed she was distant. Others believed she was disciplined. Perhaps she was both. Public affection toward the monarchy fluctuated during the 1960s and 1970s. Society was modernizing rapidly. Authority was questioned. Tradition felt outdated to younger generations. Elizabeth did not react impulsively. She adapted slowly. Carefully. Always aware that overreaction could be fatal to the institution she served. She allowed documentaries. She modernized communication. She walked a fine line between mystery and accessibility. Her philosophy was simple. Never complain. Never explain. It became both shield and prison. Years passed. Silver Jubilee in 1977. Golden Jubilee in 2002. Diamond in 2012. Through scandals, divorces, political turmoil, and personal losses, she did not publicly break. But beneath the stillness, storms gathered. Because the greatest test of her reign would not come from politics. It would come from within her own family. And when tragedy struck in 1997, silence would no longer protect her. Now we will enter the most difficult chapter of her reign. When public grief turned into anger. When the monarchy stood at the edge of collapse. And when the Queen faced a decision that could either preserve the crown or shatter it forever. History was about to demand something new from her. And this time, tradition alone would not be enough. For decades, she had mastered stillness. Wars had come and gone. Prime ministers had risen and fallen. Empires had dissolved into independent nations. Through it all, she remained unshaken, controlled, disciplined, composed. But in 1997, something happened that the monarchy was not prepared for. And for the first time in her reign, silence became dangerous. By the 1990s, the royal family was no longer protected by distance. Television had changed everything. Tabloids were relentless. The private lives of princes and princesses were no longer whispered about, they were broadcast. 3 of her 4 children had experienced broken marriages. Public sympathy began shifting. The monarchy, once untouchable, now seemed flawed. Human. Fragile. And at the center of the storm was Diana, Princess of Wales. Diana had entered the royal family as a shy 19-year-old bride in 1981. The wedding had looked like a fairy tale. Millions watched. The world believed in romance. But fairy tales rarely survive inside institutions built on duty. The marriage between Charles and Diana fractured under pressure, incompatibility, loneliness, public scrutiny. Their separation in 1992, and eventual divorce in 1996, became global spectacle. For Elizabeth, it was deeply painful. Not because of headlines. But because the institution she had spent a lifetime protecting was becoming unstable from within. Still, she followed protocol. She did not speak publicly about private matters. Then came August 31, 1997. A car crash in Paris. Diana was dead at 36. The world stopped. Crowds gathered outside Kensington Palace within hours. Flowers began piling up, first dozens, then thousands, then millions. The grief was raw. Emotional. Unfiltered. Britain was no longer the restrained nation Elizabeth had known as a young woman. It mourned loudly. Demanded visibly. At the time of Diana's death, Elizabeth was at Balmoral in Scotland with her grandchildren, William and Harry. Her instinct was immediate and maternal. Protect the boys. Shield them from cameras. Give them space to grieve privately. She believed that was her duty as grandmother. But outside Scotland, the narrative was shifting. The Queen had not returned to London. The Union flag over Buckingham Palace did not fly at half-mast, because protocol dictated it only flew when the sovereign was present. To the public, it appeared cold. Detached. Newspapers began questioning her silence. The phrase, "Where is the Queen?" echoed across front pages. It was not anger at first. It was confusion. Then frustration. Then something more dangerous, doubt. Elizabeth had faced political crises before. But this was emotional. This was personal. Public grief was turning into criticism of the monarchy itself. For the first time in her reign, the institution seemed vulnerable. Inside Balmoral, she was receiving reports. Watching television coverage. Reading headlines. She understood something crucial. The country had changed. The rules of emotional expression had changed. And tradition, in this moment, was not enough. On September 5, 5 days after Diana's death, Elizabeth made a rare live broadcast. She spoke not as sovereign, but as grandmother. She acknowledged Diana's impact. She spoke of admiration. She praised her compassion. And she bowed her head publicly as Diana's coffin passed Buckingham Palace. It was a small gesture, but symbolic. It showed something the public needed to see. Humanity. The funeral was watched by billions worldwide. Elizabeth walked behind the coffin, steady, composed, while 2 young boys followed their mother's casket. The image was unforgettable. And something shifted again. The monarchy survived that week. But it had been shaken. Deeply. Elizabeth had learned a painful lesson. Distance protects dignity. But too much distance risks disconnection. After 1997, subtle changes followed. Greater media openness. Careful modernization. Increased accessibility. She did not abandon tradition. But she adjusted its presentation. The early 2000s brought both sorrow and renewal. In 2002, within weeks, she lost both her sister Margaret and her mother. 50 years into her reign, she was suddenly the oldest monarch in British history. That same year marked her Golden Jubilee, 50 years on the throne. Crowds gathered again, not in anger this time, but celebration. Public affection had stabilized. Her consistency, once criticized, was now valued. She had become something rare in modern life. Constant. Through terrorism, economic crashes, political division, she endured. She visited Ground Zero after September 11th. She shook hands in divided nations. She represented continuity in an unstable world. By the time she celebrated her Diamond Jubilee in 2012, something unexpected had happened. The young queen who once seemed distant had become grandmother of the nation. But history was not finished testing her. Because in her later years, new storms formed. Brexit would divide the country. Family tensions would once again become public. And the man who had walked 3 steps behind her for over 70 years would not walk beside her forever. Now, we enter the final decades of her reign. Where age met endurance. Where loyalty was tested again within the family. And where the loss of her lifelong partner would quietly change everything. Because even queens feel loneliness. And sometimes the heaviest crown is the one worn in silence. By the early 2000s, Queen Elizabeth II was no longer simply a monarch. She was an era. Leaders who had once bowed before her were gone. Nations she had first visited as young queen had transformed beyond recognition. The empire she was born into had long dissolved into the Commonwealth, a voluntary association rather than a ruling force. But she remained. And the longer she remained, the heavier the symbolism became. After the Golden Jubilee, a second wind. In 2002, her Golden Jubilee marked 50 years on the throne. It was meant to be celebratory, yet the year had begun in deep sorrow. Within weeks, she had buried her sister Margaret and her mother, the Queen Mother. 2 pillars of her private life, gone. For a woman raised to restrain emotion publicly, grief became something carried quietly. There were no dramatic displays. No interviews. She returned to work. That was always her answer. Work was structure. Structure was stability. Stability was survival. During Jubilee celebrations, millions lined the streets once more. The mood felt warmer than it had in the late 1990s. Something had softened between the monarchy and the public. The Queen had endured. And endurance commands respect. A changing Britain. But Britain itself was evolving rapidly. The early 2000s saw technological acceleration, global conflict, social media's rise, and a younger generation less attached to rigid hierarchy. The monarchy had to navigate relevance in a digital age. The Queen adapted in her own way. She sent her first email publicly in the late 1970s, a little-known fact. Now, the palace began using websites, then social media platforms. Royal communications modernized cautiously. Still, she maintained her personal style. Handwritten notes. Carefully worded speeches. Measured pace. She never rushed to follow trends. She understood something fundamental. The monarchy must evolve, but never chase popularity. Chasing approval weakens authority. Private challenges behind palace walls. As the 2000s progressed, family tensions returned to public attention. Prince Charles remarried in 2005, wedding Camilla Parker Bowles in a civil ceremony. It was once unthinkable that the divorced heir to the throne would remarry publicly. Yet the Queen allowed it, quietly signaling a more flexible monarchy. Her role was not to freeze time. It was to manage change without destabilizing tradition. Then came the new generation. Prince William and Catherine married in 2011, a global event that revived fairy tale energy around the royal family. Crowds cheered. Young faces filled the streets. The Queen watched from the balcony, composed but observant. She had seen this before, in 1947, in 1981. She knew weddings were hope. But she also knew marriage inside the monarchy required resilience beyond romance. Diamond Jubilee, 2012. 60 years on the throne. Few monarchs in global history had ruled so long. The Diamond Jubilee celebrations in 2012 were grand, yet personal. River pageants. Concerts. Public appearances. At 86, she stood for hours. Smiled. Waved. Behind the scenes, aides noticed something: fatigue. Not weakness, but aging. Her step slowed slightly. Her schedule adjusted subtly. Yet she refused to reduce her commitment dramatically. The red boxes, government documents delivered daily, still arrived. She read them meticulously. Every detail mattered. Every Tuesday, she met the Prime Minister. She had now worked with over a dozen. From Winston Churchill to David Cameron, she had watched ideologies clash, economies rise and fall, wars begin and end. She never publicly intervened. But prime ministers often left their weekly audiences aware that she remembered history better than they did. Experience became her quiet authority. Brexit, a divided kingdom. In 2016, Britain voted to leave the European Union. The nation split almost evenly. Communities argued. Families debated. The Queen remained publicly neutral, as constitutional monarchs must. Yet in private, she was acutely aware of the division. Unity had always been her guiding principle. Her Christmas broadcasts that year focused heavily on reconciliation and respect. She could not influence votes. But she could influence tone. In uncertain times, her steady presence became more valuable than ever. The family strains return. The late 2010s brought renewed internal difficulties. Prince Andrew's associations and controversies created headlines that tested the monarchy's credibility. The Queen responded in the only way she knew, through decisive but quiet action. Roles were adjusted. Public duties removed. Then came Prince Harry and Meghan. In 2020, they announced their decision to step back as senior working royals. The modern monarchy faced modern expectations. Interviews followed. Allegations. Public debate intensified once more. The Queen issued a short, carefully worded statement emphasizing family and reconciliation. Behind those words was complexity. She was grandmother to Harry. Sovereign to the institution. Balancing both required extraordinary restraint. Again, she chose minimal public reaction. Silence, when used deliberately, can be strength. But it also demands emotional cost. The pandemic years. Then came 2020. A global pandemic. Lockdowns. Fear. Isolation. For the first time in modern history, Britain faced collective confinement. At 94 years old, the Queen addressed the nation in a rare special broadcast. She spoke calmly, invoking shared memory of wartime endurance. "We will meet again," she said, echoing words from World War II. It resonated. Not because of political instruction, but because she embodied continuity. She had lived through the Blitz. She understood national anxiety. Her image, seated alone at a desk, became symbolic of leadership through quiet reassurance. The loss of her strength and stay. April 9, 2021. Prince Philip died at 99. They had been married 73 years. He had walked behind her for decades. Supported. Challenged. Protected. Without him, something shifted. At his funeral, during pandemic restrictions, she sat alone in St. George's Chapel. Masked. Isolated. The image spread globally. It was not staged. It was not dramatic. But it captured something profound. Even a queen can sit alone in grief. Those close to her noticed a deepening quiet afterward. She continued working. But the rhythm changed. Philip had been her private sounding board. Her anchor. Without him, the palace corridors felt different. And yet, she did not step aside. She did not abdicate. Duty was lifelong. She had promised that at 21. Platinum Jubilee, 2022. 70 years on the throne. The first British monarch to reach such a milestone. Celebrations filled the country again. But her appearances were limited. Mobility issues had begun affecting her. She appeared on the balcony briefly. She smiled, smaller now, but genuine. The world understood something unspoken. This was likely the final major celebration of her reign. Her body was aging. Her resolve was not. The final months. In September 2022, she appointed Liz Truss as Prime Minister at Balmoral Castle. Her 15th Prime Minister. Photographs showed her thinner. Frilier. But standing. Still performing the constitutional duty she had carried for 70 years. 2 days later, on September 8, she passed away peacefully at Balmoral. The announcement was simple. No drama. No elaborate language. Just confirmation. And suddenly, Britain entered a new era. For most living people, she had always been there. Now, she was history. But what did 70 years of unwavering duty truly cost her? What sacrifices remained unseen behind palace walls? What doubts did she carry privately that never reached microphones? And how will history ultimately judge a woman who ruled without ruling, who influenced without interfering, who endured without complaining? In next part we will step beyond the ceremonies and headlines. And examine the deeper legacy she left behind. Not just as queen, but as a symbol of permanence in a world that never stops changing. Because sometimes, the greatest power is simply remaining. Time has a strange way of reshaping memory. When Queen Elizabeth II died, people did not only mourn a monarch. They mourned stability. They mourned familiarity. They mourned the quiet certainty that no matter how chaotic politics became, no matter how divided society felt, there was one constant figure at the center of it all. But legacies are complicated. And hers was no exception. For 70 years, she lived inside a paradox. She had immense symbolic authority, yet no political power. She signed laws she did not write. She opened parliaments she did not control. She advised prime ministers but could not publicly challenge them. Her influence existed in conversations that were never recorded and traditions that were never fully explained. Power, for her, was restraint. That restraint defined everything. She never voted. She never revealed political opinion. She never publicly criticized government decisions. In an era when leaders tweet instantly and argue openly, her silence often felt otherworldly. But silence was her discipline. There were moments, of course, when observers searched her speeches for hidden meaning. During tense political seasons, commentators analyzed her Christmas broadcasts word by word, looking for subtle guidance. Sometimes they found hints of unity, reconciliation, or moral reflection. But she never crossed the constitutional line. Her reign spanned extraordinary global transformation. When she was born, radio was the dominant mass medium. When she died, artificial intelligence and digital networks shaped human interaction. She witnessed humanity walk on the moon. She saw the Cold War divide the world. She saw apartheid fall. She saw Germany reunify. She saw terrorism redefine security. She saw the internet connect billions. Through all of it, she remained visibly unchanged. That was not accidental. Consistency was her strategy. Clothing colors remained bright so she could be seen in crowds. Handbags were carried in the same way. Gloves were worn for hygiene and tradition. Public gestures were deliberate and minimal. Even her humor was controlled, dry, subtle, delivered quietly. Those who met her often described surprise at her warmth in private audiences. She asked direct questions. She remembered details. She sometimes displayed unexpected wit. But the public persona was disciplined. Never dramatic. Never theatrical. She understood something many leaders do not. The monarchy is theater, but it must never look like performance. It must look like duty. That duty required sacrifice. She spent months away from her children during early Commonwealth tours. Charles later described loneliness in childhood. She did not respond defensively. She rarely responded at all. The demands of state overrode maternal instinct at times. History does not pause for bedtime stories. Her marriage required compromise. Philip adjusted to walking behind her, to never overshadowing her publicly. Their partnership endured because both understood their roles. It was not a modern romance. It was an alliance built on shared responsibility. Scandals tested her. Divorces embarrassed the institution. Interviews exposed private tensions. Tabloid culture thrived on controversy. Yet she never publicly rebuked her family. Her approach was internal correction, external calm. Critics argued that she sometimes reacted too slowly. Supporters argued that patience prevented escalation. Both perspectives can exist simultaneously. Because monarchy is not speed, it is endurance. Over time, she became less a political figure and more a cultural presence. She appeared in brief sketches with fictional characters. She allowed small moments of humor into public life, carefully measured. These gestures humanized her without undermining dignity. The balance was delicate. Too rigid, and the monarchy risks irrelevance. Too casual, and it risks trivialization. She walked that line for decades. As she aged, the symbolism intensified. Young people who had never known another monarch saw her as historical, almost permanent. She became a living bridge to World War II. To Winston Churchill. To a Britain that no longer existed physically, but survived in collective memory. When she addressed the nation during the pandemic, her words carried weight not because of policy, but because she had witnessed crisis before. Her voice carried generational authority. Yet even authority cannot defeat time. In her final years, appearances grew shorter. Mobility decreased. The cane appeared occasionally. Public events were adjusted. Still, the red boxes continued. She read government papers almost until the end. 2 days before her death, she appointed a new prime minister. There was no ceremonial farewell. No final address. Duty concluded quietly. Her death triggered Operation London Bridge, plans meticulously prepared for decades. Protocol unfolded with precision. Mourning periods were declared. World leaders arrived. Crowds gathered again, not in anger, not in uncertainty, but in respect. Her coffin traveled from Scotland to London. People waited in lines for hours to pass by silently. Some wept. Some bowed. Some simply stood still. The stillness mirrored her life. When she was laid to rest beside Prince Philip, a chapter of British history closed that had begun in 1952. 70 years. 15 prime ministers. Multiple wars. Technological revolutions. Family turmoil. Global transformation. And through it all, one steady figure. But history now asks a deeper question. Was her greatness in action? Or in constancy? Because in a century defined by dramatic leaders, bold speeches, and disruptive change, Elizabeth II governed through repetition. Through routine. Through ritual. She made continuity itself her achievement. And perhaps that is harder than it looks. In the next part, we move beyond events and examine something more complex, the unseen emotional architecture of her life. What does it mean to promise your entire life to service at 21, and actually keep that promise? What private doubts never reached the surface? What personal identity survives when role becomes everything? Because behind every symbol, there is still a human being. And her humanity is the final layer of this story. Now, we step into the quiet interior world of a queen who never publicly revealed her fears, and explore the unseen cost of a life lived entirely in service. Sometimes the loudest stories are the ones never spoken. There is a difference between being visible and being known. For 70 years, the world saw Queen Elizabeth II. But very few truly knew her. She understood early that monarchy requires distance. Familiarity may create affection, but too much familiarity weakens mystique. And mystique, for a constitutional monarch, is power. So she built a boundary. Not coldness. Not indifference. But separation. Her private thoughts remained private. Her political beliefs were never disclosed. Even her closest advisors described her as emotionally disciplined. That discipline did not mean absence of feeling. It meant control of expression. From childhood, she had been trained to regulate reaction. A raised eyebrow signaled displeasure. A slight smile indicated approval. Words were economical. She rarely raised her voice. She rarely cried publicly. Even in moments of personal grief, composure prevailed. When her father died, she did not collapse before cameras. When Diana died, she adjusted strategy without public defensiveness. When Philip died, she sat alone, silent, dignified. To the outside world, it looked like strength. To a human being, it required containment. Containment is not effortless. Imagine never fully speaking your frustration. Never sharing your political disagreement. never expressing anger toward those who criticize you publicly. The monarchy demands neutrality. Neutrality demands silence. And silence, over decades, becomes habit. Those close to her said she relaxed most in Scotland, at Balmoral. There, the rhythm slowed. She wore headscarves instead of crowns. She drove herself in the estate's open land. She walked her dogs without ceremony. It was the closest she came to normality. But even there, she was aware. Always aware. A sovereign cannot fully disappear. Her identity and her role merged so completely that separating them becomes nearly impossible. Who was Elizabeth Windsor, without the title? That question is difficult to answer because she never allowed the public to see that distinction clearly. Perhaps she herself stopped separating them long ago. When she made her vow at 21, to devote her entire life to service, she meant it literally. Entire life. Not career. Not term. Life. She never considered abdication, even when other European monarchs stepped aside for younger generations. Her uncle had abdicated for love. She would not abdicate for comfort. Responsibility, once accepted, was permanent. There were moments, surely, when fatigue must have whispered temptation. Long flights. Endless ceremonies. Constant scrutiny. But stepping away would have contradicted the promise. And she was, above all, a promise keeper. Psychologically, such dedication creates a narrowing of personal space. Your schedule is not yours. Your image is not yours. Your words are not yours alone. Every gesture carries constitutional weight. Imagine knowing that a simple facial expression during a parliamentary speech could trigger headlines or diplomatic interpretation. That awareness never leaves. Yet she cultivated small pockets of authenticity. Her laughter at horse races. Her visible amusement during light-hearted public moments. Her affection for her corgis. These glimpses reassured people that behind the structure lived a person. But she never allowed those glimpses to redefine her. Her emotional vocabulary was private. Even her children experienced that structure. Charles, sensitive and introspective, often struggled with her reserve. He longed for warmth expressed verbally. She expressed care through consistency. Consistency was her language of love. She showed up. She remained. She endured. For some, that was enough. For others, it felt distant. Leadership at that scale creates unavoidable trade-offs. Intimacy versus symbolism. Spontaneity versus stability. She chose stability. And history largely rewarded that choice. Over decades, criticism softened into respect. Younger generations who once questioned relevance came to value reliability. In turbulent political eras, she was not a policymaker, she was a reference point. When global leaders visited, they encountered not ideology, but continuity. That continuity carried psychological comfort for many nations transitioning through uncertainty. Yet internally, aging brought new challenges. Physical vulnerability is humbling for anyone, more so for someone whose image has symbolized steadiness. In her final years, aides quietly adjusted her workload. Appearances shortened. Events relocated indoors. But she resisted dramatic reduction. To stop working would have meant acknowledging decline. And she did not define herself by limitation. Even as mobility decreased, her mental discipline remained intact. She continued reading government papers. She asked precise questions. She retained astonishing memory. Those who briefed her in her 90s reported the same sharp attention to detail she had displayed decades earlier. The body slowed. The mind remained sovereign. Her death did not feel like scandal, nor abrupt tragedy. It felt like the closing of a very long chapter. Perhaps that is part of why global reaction was so profound. She had not shocked the world. She had accompanied it. For 70 years. Few leaders in history have existed long enough to become generational anchors. She did. But anchoring has emotional cost. To be constant, you must absorb change without visibly reacting to it. You must watch the world reinvent itself again and again, and remain. That endurance may look simple from distance. It is not simple at all. It is a discipline of self. And now, with her gone, a final question emerges. Did she shape history? Or did history shape her? Perhaps both. Because when a person lives long enough within an institution, they become inseparable from it. In the next part, we move toward the final reflection. Not events. Not crises. But legacy. How will future generations interpret her 70 years? Was she the last monarch of a fading era? Or the model for survival in a modern world? Now we examine the long shadow she leaves behind, and whether the monarchy she protected so carefully can endure without her presence at its center. Because sometimes, the true test of leadership begins only after it ends. When Queen Elizabeth II died, something unusual happened. There was no chaos. No constitutional panic. No institutional collapse. The transition was immediate. London Bridge is down. Within seconds of that coded message, machinery decades in preparation began moving. The crown passed automatically to her eldest son. The proclamation followed. Ceremonies unfolded precisely as planned. It was seamless. And that seamlessness may be her greatest achievement. Because the ultimate test of a monarch is not how they rule, but whether the system survives them. For 70 years, she had been the emotional center of the monarchy. Her face was on currency. Her image stamped on stamps. Her Christmas messages a yearly ritual. For most of the population, she had always been there. That kind of longevity creates identity fusion. Nation and monarch become psychologically intertwined. When she died, Britain did not simply lose a head of state. It lost continuity. The question immediately became clear. Can the monarchy endure without her? Because Elizabeth II was not dramatic. She was not controversial in policy. She did not dominate headlines through personality. She endured through predictability. Her son, now King Charles III, inherited not just a throne, but comparison. He steps into a different era. A faster era. A louder era. An era less patient with hierarchy. Elizabeth's long reign had buffered the monarchy against volatility. She was the human stabilizer between tradition and public opinion. Without her, the institution stands more exposed. Public trust in monarchy often mirrored public trust in her personally. That distinction matters. Surveys conducted during her later years consistently showed high approval for her, sometimes higher than for the institution itself. She had become the monarchy. Now the monarchy must function without the woman who embodied it. History shows that monarchies survive when they adapt carefully. Too rigid, they fracture. Too flexible, they dissolve into irrelevance. Elizabeth mastered that middle ground. The question is whether that balance was transferable, or uniquely hers. Her reign also redefined constitutional monarchy for the modern world. She proved that political neutrality, when practiced consistently, can maintain legitimacy even in divided societies. She demonstrated that symbolism, when grounded in routine, can stabilize a democracy rather than threaten it. In a century marked by dictators, populists, and ideological revolutions, she remained apolitical. Not because she lacked opinions, but because expressing them publicly would weaken the structure she served. That self-restraint preserved the monarchy's constitutional role. Future monarchs inherit that model. But they also inherit a more skeptical audience. Generational attitudes toward royalty have shifted. Younger citizens question inherited privilege more openly. Media scrutiny is constant. Social platforms amplify criticism instantly. Elizabeth operated largely before the age of digital outrage. Her later years entered it, but her reputation had already been cemented. Her successors must build credibility in a world that moves faster and forgets quicker. And yet, her shadow remains protective. For decades to come, comparisons will frame discussion. What would the Queen have done? That question alone reflects her enduring influence. Legacy is not only about admiration. It is about standard. She set one. Not through dramatic speeches or sweeping reform, but through repetition of duty. Through showing up. Through reading the red boxes even on Christmas Day. Through maintaining weekly audiences for 70 years. Through never abandoning the vow she made at 21. My whole life, whether it be long or short. It was long. And she kept it. There is also a broader historical lens. She was born into empire and died in a globalized world of independent nations. The British Empire dissolved during her reign. Decolonization reshaped continents. The Commonwealth evolved into a voluntary association rather than an imperial remnant. She navigated that transition without public bitterness. She traveled extensively to former colonies, not to assert dominance, but to maintain relationship. That soft diplomacy preserved goodwill in many places where political ties had loosened immensely. Her approach to change was incremental. Never sudden. Never reactionary. That incrementalism frustrated some critics who desired bold modernization. But it prevented abrupt destabilization. History may judge that approach kindly. Because institutions that rush reform often fracture. Institutions that resist entirely often collapse. She avoided both extremes. Now, with her reign complete, scholars and historians begin interpreting rather than observing. Was she transformative? Or preservative? Perhaps her transformation was preservation. In a century of volatility, maintaining stability may be radical enough. But legacy is not frozen at death. It evolves. Future controversies within the royal family will retroactively color interpretation. Economic shifts will influence public appetite for monarchy. Political tensions within the United Kingdom, especially in Scotland and Northern Ireland, may redefine national identity. Her successors must navigate those realities without her personal authority to buffer criticism. That is the final inheritance she leaves them. A functioning system. But one that must prove itself again. Because no institution is permanently secure. Even one that lasted 70 years under her guidance. Now we step back completely. Beyond politics, beyond ceremony, and ask the most human question of all. When the titles fade and the rituals end. Who was Elizabeth Windsor? And what does a life entirely devoted to duty mean? When the duty is finally over? When the state ceremonies ended? When the crowds dispersed? When the flags were folded and the processions concluded? What remained was not just a queen. What remained was a life. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor was born into privilege. But not into destiny. She did not chase power. She did not campaign for influence. She did not design a political vision. Power found her. And once it did, she never tried to escape it. That choice defines her more than any jewel in the crown. Because she could have chosen differently. Her uncle had. Abdication was not unthinkable in her lifetime, it was precedent. European monarchies stepped aside for younger heirs in modern decades. Retirement would have been understandable after 60 years. But she did not step aside. Not because she clung to authority. But because she viewed authority as obligation. There is something psychologically rare about a person who accepts responsibility at 25, unexpectedly, and never relinquishes it. She did not live for self-expression. She lived for continuity. Continuity is not glamorous. It is repetitive, predictable, quiet. And yet, without continuity, societies fracture more easily than they realize. Her life followed structure more than impulse. Morning briefings, official audiences, ceremonial obligations, seasonal relocations between residences. It could appear mechanical from the outside. But discipline is not absence of personality. It is containment of it. She enjoyed horse racing with genuine enthusiasm. She studied bloodlines with expertise. She laughed freely in private when something amused her. She valued punctuality intensely. She disliked unnecessary fuss. She preferred simple meals. These details matter, because they remind us that even symbols are human. Her greatest strength may have been emotional endurance. She experienced global admiration and harsh criticism. She saw her children struggle publicly. She lost family members. She aged in front of cameras. And through it all, she did not defend herself in interviews. She did not write memoirs. She did not justify decisions publicly. Silence was not weakness. It was philosophy. Never complain, never explain. That phrase became shorthand for her reign. But beneath it lies a deeper truth. Explaining invites argument. Complaining invites sympathy. She chose neither. Sympathy diminishes authority. Argument politicizes it. So she stood still. In modern culture, stillness is misunderstood. We celebrate bold personalities, outspoken leaders, emotional transparency. She represented the opposite. Measured expression, controlled tone, minimal commentary. And yet, millions trusted her. Trust built slowly. Through repetition. Through seeing the same face year after year, unchanged by election cycles. When she addressed the nation during crisis, people listened. Not because she offered solutions, but because she represented shared experience. She had lived long enough to remember hardship others only read about. That longevity gave weight to her words. But longevity also isolates. Imagine outliving most of your contemporaries. Watching prime ministers grow old and retire. Attending state funerals again and again. Becoming the last living connection to an earlier era. Time elevates, and separates. By her 90s, she was no longer just head of state. She was living history. And living history carries quiet loneliness. When Prince Philip died, the image of her sitting alone at his funeral resonated deeply. Not because she was queen, but because she was widow. Grief does not disappear beneath titles. It waits. In her final months, aides noticed increasing physical fragility. Yet she insisted on fulfilling constitutional duties as long as possible. 2 days before her death, she appointed a new prime minister. Even then, work first. There was no dramatic farewell speech. No final grand address. Her ending mirrored her life. Quiet. Structured. Unembellished. History will debate her reign for decades. Some will argue she protected privilege. Others will argue she protected stability. Some will say she represented outdated hierarchy. Others will say she embodied constitutional balance. All interpretations will coexist. But one fact remains indisputable. She kept her promise. My whole life, whether it be long or short. It was long. 70 years on the throne. 70 years of not resigning when criticized. Of not speaking out when provoked. Of not retreating when tired. Few modern leaders experience even a fraction of that duration. Fewer still maintain composure throughout. When the crown was placed upon her head in 1953, it symbolized authority. But over time, it symbolized endurance. And perhaps that is her most lasting legacy. Not dominance. Not transformation. But endurance. Because in a century defined by upheaval, she remained. And sometimes, remaining is the most difficult act of all. Thank you for staying through this entire journey. Before we close, from which part of the world are you watching this story? And what time is it right now where you are? History connects us across continents and time zones. And tonight, we remembered a woman who connected generations simply by being there. End of series.